Hello there everyone, and welcome back to Obscure Star Wars EU. This is episode 3 of this series that I'm doing, and yet again I have some obscure Star Wars EU to talk about. Now for episode 3, I'm going to be covering the Star Wars Miniatures League promotions, which were a set of 4 cards that all had an original RPG story depicting original events on each of these cards. Now, where could you get these cards? These cards were actually originally given out for free at select role-player game stores in 2008. 2008 was around the year that they were coming out with the Star Wars Miniatures line of products from Wizards of the Coast. These Star Wars Miniatures sets all had miniatures packs that promoted various eras of the Star Wars universe. They had stuff for Legacy, Dark Times, Knights of the Old Republic, various eras of the Star Wars universe. These miniatures were their own RPG line, kind of separated from the other Wizards of the Coast line of products. And Wizards of the Coast marketed Star Wars miniatures in a very rigorous fashion. You saw Star Wars miniatures promotions everywhere, in the back of comics, on posters. Star Wars miniatures was everywhere. It was the next big thing. In 2008, at RPG stores in the Midwest is what I've heard, so not all RPG stores, but select RPG stores were sent these cards that had these stories on them, and they were given out for free. So there's probably an extremely low circulation on them. These are pretty rare. The first of these is called Infestation and takes place prior to Knights of the Old Republic, the video game, and is set around the time of the KOTOR comics. Basically, Infestation tells a story that includes the Churka Corporation, Zalbar, and Mandalorians banding together and fighting against a species called the Boma. Something interesting about the Boma is that they first appeared in the Tales of the Jedi comic book series, but they didn't actually appear in the Knights of the Old Republic game. They did appear in Knights of the Old Republic 2 and in SWTOR, but the Boma didn't really appear in KOTOR, so it's kind of interesting that the Boma featured in a KOTOR tie-in story, as this is set in Treas in the Underworld. It's really cool to get Zalbar in here as well, before his appearance in Knights of the Old Republic, the video game. So the Churka Corporation basically hires Zalbar to lead a squad against the Boma, and that is part of the information that's given, and then there's also some Mandalorians working with the Churka as well. So the story has, the meat of it is in the overview section, and the overview section reads, "In an undercity that faces the constant threat of roving Raghouls, only a major threat can mobilize the outcasts to go looking for trouble. But this is the situation you now face. A new menace preys on Raghoul and person alike. Bomas are not native to Treas. However, neither are many other exotic animals that the Upworlders display in their decadent mansions throughout the spires above. To no one's surprise, when the nobility becomes bored with such expensive pets, many strange creatures suddenly end up in the Undercity. Many of them don't last long. What might surprise many, however, is that a small population of Bomas now thrives in the Undercity, in part due to the creature's resistance to Raghoul disease. No one is sure if this condition is developed or fortuitous, or was purposely engineered by Upworlders. But these Bomas are now carriers of the disease. This small clan is breeding rapidly and represents a growing threat to the outcast population. Only by working together can you wipe out this danger." And you is like a second person to describe this squad of people led by Churka. So it's very interesting that the Churka Corporation would mobilize and hire Mandalorians and Zalbar to take part in this. This is clearly during the Mandalorian occupation of Treas. I mean, we have an amazing art piece here for this Mandalorian here. But this art piece is also included on one of the miniatures box sets, and it was drawn by a absolutely fantastic artist named Treas Nielsen. Treas Nielsen is a Star Wars artist who has drawn numerous book covers and other art pieces for the Star Wars universe. She has a very distinct style and is quite frankly just an absolutely incredible artist. What she said about the art piece featured on the Infestation RPG card short story is that, quote, "I wasn't familiar with Mr. Mandalore until asked to paint another illustration for the Star Wars Minis package. Here's a little bit about what his life is about. Mandalore the Ultimate established his reputation as a brazen strategist who was capable of immense destruction. He led a merciless campaign in the Outer Rim territories, authorizing the devastation of such planets as Cathar, and allowing his armies to sack the world of Althir. Even as the Republic began to respond to his aggressions, he continued to lead his Mandalorians with brutal efficiency. As the war escalated, Mandalore proved that he was willing to do anything to win his cause, even to the point of using nuclear devices to destroy entire cities. I'm not sure if he uses nuclear devices or nuclear weapons, but either way, he's a bad. As for what mediums I used, I just stuck with acrylic and colored pencils on this one. I left the oil tucked away under my acrylic palette. Most likely it was dried out, and I was too lazy to squeeze out a new palette full." So that's what Tira Nielsen said about her art piece that was featured on the Infestation short story. I'm not sure exactly where it goes in the timeline, but it has to go during the Mandalorian occupation of Taris. So probably sometime during the KOTOR comic series, as that's when we saw the Mandalorians start to invade Taris and take it over. So it probably fits in somewhere in between the KOTOR comics, and definitely before KOTOR, because we have Zalbar literally being hired by the Churka Corporation in the context of this story. Next up, we have Assault on Treas. Assault on Treas has an overview that's a little smaller, and it says, "The Treas Academy, an ancient Sith academy on Malachor V, has been discovered. You have assembled an elite squad to search the structure, either to destroy the holocrons containing the teachings of the dark side, or to claim them as your own. This would be a relatively simple task, if you were the only ones there." So this is a very interesting scenario here, because it has something interesting to say about its time period. In the player setup section, it says, "Don't worry about era. The twisted halls of Treas seem to exist beyond normal space and time." That's kind of weird. Are they implying that the Treas Academy exists outside of the universe, outside of time and space, in a world of its own? A world between worlds, if you will? That's definitely an interesting thing to say about it. Now, it does recommend that you play with an Old Republic squad of Jedi led by Bastila, and a Sith squad led by Revan, and a Mandalorian squad led by Mandalore the Indomitable. But, it also has art depicting Luke Skywalker, art that was also drawn by Treas Nielsen. She said about her art piece of Luke, "I was asked to illustrate Luke in battle armor, Boba Fett, and Darth Talon all at once. All very cool characters. The description Paul gave me for the Luke piece was pretty minimal, which in most cases is nice and lets the artist really do what they're trained to do. So I had 2 comic book references of Luke in his stealth armor as a guide, and then went on a search for some decent face reference. After the reference was gathered, I worked up the sketch to go through the approval channels, and then I started slinging paint for the final. Actually, I did all 3 sketches at once and submitted those. I made any needed adjustments and then went on to the painted version." So that's what Treas Nielsen had to say regarding her art piece featured on Assault on the Treas Academy. So it's up in the air when this story takes place. I think it makes most sense for Luke's era for it to be taking place, because it says that it's an ancient Sith academy on Malachor V that has recently been discovered. Treas Academy is featured in SWTOR and in KOTOR, and is referenced in some other comic books, so I feel like by the time of Revan and Bastila, which is who it suggests is fighting there, I feel like they'd be aware of it. So for it to have just been discovered doesn't make sense to me. So that's why I feel like it works better in like a post-Return of the Jedi time period. Luke and some of his Jedi discovered the ancient Treas Academy. Maybe Tion's looking for some holocrons in there, and some dark cult faction of would-be Sith stumble upon it as well. I think that's where it makes the most sense to be put. I mean, the art piece of Luke going alongside of it just makes it seem like it would be a perfect fit. That being said, it says it exists outside of time and space, so maybe it is in the KOTOR era with Bastila and Revan. So when would this take place? Well, it would take place before the KOTOR game, during the Jedi Civil War, I guess. In the Sith Squad section, it literally says, Darth Revan has come here seeking secrets for his own dark purposes. So, could it take place pre-KOTOR? It very well could, but as the story itself suggests, it could take place in multiple eras. Does it even exist in this universe? This is a very intriguing scenario to me because it leaves a lot of gray areas and has some cool stuff that it adds to the lore. Third, we have Sandstorm, which reads, when the storms come on Tatooine, even the Tusken Raiders take cover. But you're not from around here, so you don't really know better. The Zon Consortium has paid you well to bring back the COM codes on Tatooine and download some very sensitive and valuable files. The Hutts lie low when the storms blow through, so this is really an opportunity. Many parties are interested in this information, so the sooner you get the job done and leave, the better. Of course, it would be easier if you were the only one who had this thought. So Sandstorm's another interesting story. The art piece depicts a young Obi-Wan, so I'm not really sure what that has to do with this story. Now, what's very, very, very interesting about this is that it features the Zon Consortium, which the Zon Consortium originates in the Empire at War game expansions, and we know that the Zon Consortium was founded in 19 BBY. So since the Zon Consortium sent freelancers, as it says later on in this RPG card, that means that it must take place after the Consortium was founded, which it was founded in 19 BBY. So it was founded just around the time of Revenge of the Sith in the Dark Times. So since it takes place during the Dark Times, that means it takes place in at least the original trilogy era, because it would have to take place after 19 BBY. So I'm still guessing it takes place before A New Hope in 0 BBY. It also features Jabba the Hutt as a crime lord, but that can take place in 1920 BBY, anywhere in there. It also features Black Sun, so basically you have the Zon Consortium, the Hutts, and the Black Sun, 3 criminal organizations all looking for some codes at the same time, and then having to bring them back to Mos Eisley. This is such an awesome event that is depicted here. While we've had skirmishes between Black Sun, the Hutts, and the Zon Consortium before, it's great to have another instance of a confirmed conflict between them as they all search for the same thing. I don't know what Obi-Wan has to do with this. Hey, maybe old Obi-Wan was involved in this in some way. You never know. But that being said, this is just a free-for-all battle between different criminal organizations, and I think the information added here is really cool. There's extra information about how the adventure takes place that adds a lot more lore that I'm not going to read here, but my friend Marcel Ryan will probably eventually do readings of all of these, so you'll have to keep your eyes peeled on his channel. Finally, we have Shadows of the Force, which actually has its author written down, Darian and Dwayne Stupak. Now that sounds like an alias to me for some reason, just Stupak sounds very amusing, but here's the overview for Shadows of the Force, featuring Anakin and Ahsoka. Republic spies have gathered critical information that Separatist leaders are gathering on Moonalist to assess the current tactical situation. Eager to end the war, the Republic dispatches a detachment of special operatives to infiltrate the meeting and solve the problem then and there. However, when the infiltrating troops arrive, Separatist counterintelligence officers are lying in wait for them. It's a trap! The plan was masterminded by General Grievous, who used advanced holograms to weave illusions of Separatist leaders, and later of members of the ambushing force. A desperate battle ensues, and the attacking Republic force can never be certain which opponents are real until they are hit by enemy attacks. The art depicts Anakin and Ahsoka side by side, once again drawn by Therese Nielsen, and of that art piece, she said, "I'm not always up to speed on everything related to the Star Wars universe. Ahsoka was not a familiar character to me. The art director provided me with a general direction to take. Art description. Anakin Skywalker will be behind his apprentice Ahsoka Tano, a talented teen Padawan. 13 years of age or so. She will be in the front, almost a back-to-back standoff with an off-camera enemy. She fights with a reverse grip sometimes. So I created an original sketch. The first version didn't quite nail the essence of what Ahsoka was about. They provided me with more reference to round out my understanding of her look. I shot photos of my niece, which I felt would be a great model for this character, and proceeded with sketch number 2. The second sketch got the nod, so we went on to the painting stage. The first painted version was submitted. They had a few adjustments they wanted to see, so I had the opportunity to spend a little more time on the piece, tinkering with the background values as well as rendering out a few more costume details. This is how the final art looked, which you now see adorning the box. This art piece I actually enjoy quite a bit. Now what's interesting about this is Anakin Skywalker's got his very much Revenge of the Sith look. There was a first Battle of Moonlist. In 22 BBY, it was one of the first battles in the Clone Wars, as depicted in Clone Wars 2003 from Genndy Tartakovsky. In that battle, Obi-Wan and Anakin fought against Dirge and the Banking Clan. But this battle is clearly a different battle. So Shadows of the Force depicts a second battle on Moonlist, separate from the first battle early in the Clone Wars. So it's kind of cool that later on in the war, seemingly much later, near the end of the war, a separate battle on the same planet took place. I think that's pretty cool. Also, Anakin and Ahsoka are here. Also, Dirge is here, because it says on the Separatist squad, the bounty hunter Dirge lays the Separatist ambush, amassing a force of droids both real and holographic. So this holographic technology is very interesting, since I don't believe we saw it anywhere else in the EU. So it's kind of interesting that the Separatists had access to holographic technology. Also on the Republic squad, it makes sure to mention that Anakin Skywalker and his young Padawan lead the Infiltration Force. So what's really cool about this to me is that means Ahsoka and Anakin both fought against Dirge. We don't have confirmation of a battle like this anywhere else in the EU. So Ahsoka and Anakin fighting Dirge on Moonlist. This means it must take place prior to Ahsoka leaving the Jedi Order, and must take place prior to Dirge's death at the hands of Anakin. So this really feels like a crossover between Dave Filoni's The Clone Wars show and the Clone Wars multimedia project that the EU had crafted before Filoni came in, because there's clearly references to both. I think Shadows of the Force is definitely the most interesting of all 4 of these RPG scenarios, just because of the implications that this lore adds to the universe. But what do you guys think of these 4 RPG card scenario stories? Do you think they add some interesting information to the lore like I do? Are these super obscure that you hadn't heard of them? Or were you aware of these free cards that were handed out to people? It's hard for me to see how you can get more obscure than this, but the information here is bona fide EU, and I think it's just so cool. Which of these cards do you think is the coolest and adds the most to the lore? Let me know in the comments section.